How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the Soul Ward. I am Bryce Newberger, and we are getting into a video that I've called Saving Alex. This is born really from my study of Alex as I've engaged with his podcast. I've listened to him in debates, started my real awareness of him through the Jubilee video. And then since then, I've kind of gone down the Alex O'Connor Cosmic Skeptic rabbit hole. And the more I watched Alex, the more impressed I've been with him, and the more drawn to his line of reasoning. I like the way that he formulates arguments. I like the way that his mind grapples with certain things. Um, I was really interested in some guest appearances he's had, and some questions that have been posed to him multiple times, which has been, what would it take for you to become a Christian? And Alex seems to say anything short of personal special revelation, right? That God would have to manifest himself somehow personally to Alex for Alex to believe. And really, that is a form of empiricism, not in a way that he could replicate it to anyone else, but that he himself would have, felt, seen, tasted, touched, impressed, whatever the case may be, in a believable way upon him. So it's kind of that doubting Thomas, I will not believe unless I can put my fingers into the holes in Jesus's hand style, though he hasn't stated it that drastically. He's just said, he would need some sort of, and he doesn't know what it would look like, but some sort of divine, intervention for him to shift his belief system. And I do think that comes from his brand of skepticism. So as I've looked through it, I take that with a grain of salt, because as I've watched him sit with some very impressive thinkers, some men that I look up to, and they have not really been able to shift his positions. And that's been really interesting. A good example that we're going to use a lot in here is Dr. William Lane Craig on the Kalam cosmological argument. And although Alex sat down with him and had a great discussion with him, Alex has a whole follow-up video where he talks about debunking Cosmic Skeptic, and he revisits his take on the Kalam, and he humbly, and I think quite admirably, admits all of his problems that he had with the Kalam, and his almost willful ignorance that he had originally. And he uses it as a tool to sharpen not just himself, but his audience, and to say, hey, you should try to steelman your opponents. But his logical follow through on that seems to be lacking. And I want to try not to, I'm not here to bash Alex or strawman him or engage in a lot of ad hominem attacks on him. That's not my goal here. I've almost treated him like I would one of my clients on the counseling business that I work for, where if we were sitting across from each other, I'm not just listening to what they're saying, I'm getting a bigger picture psychologically of how that person is, just their psychology, their philosophy, their belief system, the way they chew with things. And one thing I thought was interesting is, although Alex has a lot of humility to his time with Dr. Craig, and I've seen him, his multiple appearances. The most recent one I watched was the debating the historicity of the cross. And even so, Alex would say, well, something strange happened Easter morning, right? And that's the most he can say, which I think is really humble, but also reserves that skepticism. There is something going on in Alex. And so we're going to psychologize him a bit. And I know you always are on rocky ground when you do that, because no one knows Alex better than himself and God, as I say, as a theist. But I see in my line of work, right, where I meet with people and we untangle problems. And as I have people that I have therapists that I meet with, I have counselors that I meet with, that also help me get an outside perspective of myself. I have a really good best friend who I love to chew some of my thoughts with, and he can always give me a good outside perspective. Sometimes we're too close to the problem, and we need that outside view. So that's what I hope to add here. first, as I watched him, I'm not Dr. Craig, I'm not Dr. Collins, I'm not Jordan Peterson or anyone like that. However, as I humbly looked at his interactions with them, and I thought, what could I possibly add to the conversation as he's talked to these great men? And I think the only thing I could really add is a bit of psychological perspective, looking at Alex and seeing at how he chews with this and giving my analysis. And I think through that, we can answer the question on what would it take for Alex O'Connor to become a Christian? That's going to bring us to our Saving Alex, right? Saving Alex O'Connor. And I mean, save in the eschatological sense, right? And this is fueled with that kind of pendulette heart of, right, if I truly care, then I would like to give a good case for Alex or his, audience members, really with the hope that I'd like to see him in heaven. I'd like to spend, I'd like to call him a brother in Christ, and I'd like to see him come through with that logical follow through. And with Dr. Craig on the Kalam, although he debunked his previous stance, he doesn't seem to engage or shift. And as I've seen, he talked to Dr. Craig, I believe 4 years ago. And as I've watched his more recent takes on things, he hasn't shifted at all on the Kalam as far as still refuting it. And there were some real problems in his worldview. And he even admitted at the end of that his view was radical. And I think really untenable and unlivable. And I don't think Alex, because of his adherence to skepticism, has allowed himself to logically follow through with that and gain some coherence with his worldview. So I'm going to give a really intimate breakdown, itemized breakdown of all of that. Let's dive on in. I don't want to take too long on this because I can be long-winded. I even thought about having, it would almost be better to put on one of his videos and do a step-by-step commentary on where I see his mind working. Instead, I'm just going to reference what I've seen, because if I actually put on the video evidence, this will be a 4-hour video, which some people might enjoy. I could definitely talk for 4 hours. My recording schedule's been crazy. I've got a baby due anytime now. And so my wife is working from home. She monopolizes my office as she's still doing her day job. And so I can't really record in here because my wife isn't here when I would like to record. And as much as I thought about, I could just record a video while she's in here, some of my comments have been very gracious and wonderful, but I still get a lot of people being, I think one person called me a fat mouth breather who hates logic. Which I could take, but I wouldn't dare subject my wife to something like that. So if she was in the background or something and someone's like, look at your whatever kind of wife, I'm thick-skinned, but I wouldn't want to put my wife in that position, especially being so heavily pregnant. People on the internet can be quite cruel. And if I couldn't take it, I wouldn't be on the internet. So I don't want to put her on the internet when that's not her personality at all. Anyways, that being said, too many tangents. Let's get into it. Alex O'Connor breakdown. So he's described himself as violently agnostic. I see in him a closed system naturalist and a Mereological nihilist, really, is what that breaks down to be. And I see his philosophy, I would describe it as postmodern in his philosophy, though I'm not sure he would wear that. But even the school of skepticism would be, if you watch my video on postmodern atheism, I believe that his approach to deconstruction and skepticism is totally in line with the postmodern toolkit when it comes to philosophy. So Alex, there's this famous argument from Evil, and Alex said that this is the S tier. In one of his videos, he said this is the S tier argument against God. And when he presents this to theists, they don't find it that compelling. So it's interesting that he's promoted to the theist. Here's the argument from Evil, and he's like, this is something that every theist has got to stare down, as if it's some sort of smoking gun, some sort of sword of Damocles that we're all dealing with as theists, and perhaps we're unaware of it or in denial of it, but none of us find it really that compelling. So it's interesting. On one hand, he thinks it's S tier. On the other hand, theists aren't really bothered by this. This is the classical argument from Evil, and then I'm going to give Alex has refined it a little bit, and I like his refinement. But this is the classical argument. Premise 1: if God exists, he is omnipotent, all-powerful, and omnibenevolent, morally perfect. They would also say omniscient and omnipresent, but for the case of the argument, there it is. We're going to be more focused here. Point number 2, an omnipotent being could prevent all unnecessary suffering. Okay, fair. Point number 3, because he's omnipotent. Point number 3, an omnibenevolent being would want to prevent all unnecessary suffering. So the first one is does he have the power? The second one is, if he has the power, then he would be, and if he's good, an implication upon that power, then he would, right? Point number 4, unnecessary suffering exists. Point number 5, therefore, an omnipotent and omnibenevolent God does not exist. It's funny, I just watched Batman v Superman with my kids. Not a great movie, but it was fun to watch it with them. And Lex Luthor says, the greatest lie is that power can be innocent. I had already written I'd already filmed actually one take on this and listened back to it, and I was a little bit too hasty, which is why I'm going to try and slow down and speak slower. And I went off script almost too much. So this is take number 2 later at night. But it was funny to see Lex kind of ascribe this this problem. Here's Alex's refined argument from evil, and I think his refinement is important. So we go from 5 points to 6, and Alex is going to focus on metaphysics, which is, anyone who's been watching the last few videos of this series I've been doing knows that I love metaphysics. So here's the refined argument from evil by Alex. Point number 1, if God exists, he's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. We add omniscience here because it does come into play a little bit more. Not that the other one didn't have it, but it comes into play. So number 2, if God is the creator of all contingent reality, including the metaphysical laws that govern the universe, physics, biology, causality. So if God is the creator of all contingent reality, or not if, but God is, right? And this is the point that we're going to grant for the sake of the argument. Not that Alex would really believe that God is the creator, but for the point of the argument, God, Alex is saying to the theist, okay, God exists. If he exists, he's omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent. Okay. If he's all those things, God is the creator of all contingent reality, including the metaphysical laws that govern the universe. It's very important to his argument. Point number 3, these laws necessarily give rise to immense and widespread suffering, including natural evils, disease, natural disasters, predation, and evolutionary cruelty. Point number 4, many instances of this suffering are gratuitous. They serve no greater good and are not logically necessary for free will, soul-making, or moral development. Point number 5, an omnibenevolent God would not choose to create a reality structured such that gratuitous suffering necessarily results. Point number 6, therefore, the existence of gratuitous suffering is strong evidence against the existence of an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. So this is an accusation of internal incoherence. So granting the theist what they want and what they say, and you follow the theist through on his claims of God, his claims are logically incoherent. That's what Alex would say. And so let's go through this point by point and show why the theist struggles to engage with this premise, and where Alex struggles to really listen to the theist. And I hope we can give a unique take. I haven't heard anyone bring these points that I'm going to bring today to Alex, though they have their roots in classical theism. And I'll give the proofs of those. Point number 1's pretty easy, though. If God exists, he is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, right? All-powerful, all-knowing, and morally perfect. The theist reaction would be almost no pushback. This is standard classical theism. As a debate tactic, this is not controversial. It builds common ground. It's a good place to start from. You always want to start from a good premise where everyone agrees. And this is where I get into the weeds with atheists who deny metaphysics and agnostics who say no one can know anything. Because I struggle to find a point 1 premise that we can agree upon, that we can build common logic into. They will use the tools of logic, but they will deny things like causality and non-contradiction. So I like that Alex has started with a premise that we can all agree with. Now, premise number 2, I don't refute, but I've seen other theists struggle with it, and we're going to talk about why. Premise number 2, God is the creator of all contingent reality, including the metaphysical laws that govern this universe, physics, biology, causality. Alex's aim is to hold God accountable for the structure of reality itself, not just human choices within it. And I think that's totally fair to press upon the theist. If God is omnipotent, then he is all powerful, which means part of that all power means that he is also over metaphysical laws and needs to answer for them if they're insufficient or lead to gratuitous suffering. So some theist reactions vary. Some say God created logic, time, physics. He could have made any kind of a world, and that's where I fall into, and that's why I have no problem with premise number 2. Others say God is subject to logic and creates within constraints. Logic is co-eternal with his nature. And this is where we fall into a kind of Euthyphro-like trap. I'll get to that in a moment. But where Alex will push for those who will say that, and this is where we frame the Euthyphro-like trap, is he frames this as a divine design choice. If God could have chosen a different metaphysical structure, he's morally culpable for the suffering that structure entails. And I agree, that logic follows. If God couldn't have made another kind of world, is he really omnipotent? I agree, that logic follows. But here's the Euthyphro-like trap. So the Euthyphro dilemma is God good because he chooses the good? Or is it good, or is good just whatever God does, right? So something good because God chooses to be good, or is it good because it's what God does? So if logic constrains him, is he subordinate to it, right? So instead of talking about good, we're talking about logic, metaphysics, right? So Alex uses this, he used this with Dr. Collins, where he talked about, could a master paint the Mona Lisa with anything but a paintbrush, right? And I thought that was a good way to frame it. But this bogs down the debate. It becomes a metaphysical turf war about whether God is the author of logic or bound by it. It's fascinating, but if someone struggles with this premise like Dr. Collins did, it won't move the debate to either side. And I think the problem that Dr. Collins had, we'll talk more about this later, is Dr. Collins is first and foremost a scientist, and this is a philosophical question. So you just asked a scientist a metaphysical philosophical question, and you could see Dr. Francis Collins, struggled to grapple with the philosophy of Alex's premise here in point number 2. But thinking philosophically, we shouldn't have a problem with that. The logic follows. I think Christians who are grounded in this kind of one-to-one thinking when it comes to how the universe is, you kind of get this Molinism, like this is the best universe. It is maximally good, and God could do no better. And I think that's true. I think God could do no better than what he made, because I think God is maximally perfect. But Alex is asking a question, which is, does God rule over metaphysics? And so what someone should say is, yes, he does. And he made this universe because he does, and he's perfect, right? Not that he can't. And that's what people struggle to engage with. So I think this is a very good point number 2. I think it's a very important refinement. And I think theists should take this very serious. And I don't just mean Christians. That's why I corrected myself. Any Abrahamic faith, anyone who believes in an omnipotent creator, an omnipotent being, whoever that may be, should believe that their omnipotent creator then oversees metaphysical laws. The logic flows. And so Christians shouldn't have an issue with this. So Alex really wants to debate 3 and 4, his third and fourth premise. That's where the real debate lives. But point 2 is often a philosophical detour. And although it does set the stage for the real aim to show God is morally responsible for the world's suffering, because he authored the system, Alex can struggle to get caught here. And I think this is where his skeptic, challenger, devil's advocate can kind of play out. Because instead of trying to untangle sometimes and this is what it felt like in the Dr. Collins debate. Instead of trying to help Dr. Collins kind of untangle the mess he was making logically, he seemed to almost press the advantage in a debate tactic. And I don't think Alex is the kind of person who wants to do that. I think he's just a psychological assassin. Like, I think he's just sharp and almost like a predator. He pounced on the prey when they were caught in a trap that he didn't really mean to lay. And so I think Alex could do a better job at helping someone like Dr. Collins get through this. Now, I'd also argue that this is probably the wrong topic for Dr. Collins, because I'll talk about this later, but when you have a scientist, you might want to stick to science if you want to get the full use out of the doctorate that you have on your show, and you want to access that knowledge. By having a doctor of science and then asking a question that a doctor of philosophy would appreciate, it's almost like a kid going to their math teacher and asking them history questions, right? They're an adult. They might be able to answer a few things, but maybe ask your math questions to the math teacher. Maybe ask your philosophy questions to the philosopher. So point number 3, though, if he can get past that mess that some people can get caught in number 2, is these laws necessarily give rise to immense and gratuitous suffering. And I would agree with immense. I think we would need to choose our words a little bit more carefully on gratuitous. Not that he framed it this way, but it seems like he says, where I'm following his logic is he really pushes the gratuitous. I would say maybe just immense. But where Alex really wants to engage is here. He wants to focus on animal suffering, natural disasters, disease, evolutionary cruelty, especially when no free will or moral growth is involved. And that's why he focuses on animals. Because if you focus on human suffering, we can say, well, they were refined through the fire. And he's like, great, what do you tell that to the deer who burned to death over 6 hours, right? There's no heaven for them. So how did that, why was it okay? It's almost like a kid with a magnifying glass setting ants on fire, right? There's no moral growth to that. So it just seems cruel and unnecessary. And these instances appear gratuitous. They don't seem to serve any soul-making purpose. And theists our defenses can often falter here. You can deal with young earth creationists who just deny the premise altogether. You can deal with classical theists who appeal to mystery or inscrutable divine purpose, which is hard to engage with. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's hard to engage with. Or Molinists who suggest maybe this is the best feasible world, which can sound like special pleading, right? God, well, you can't really challenge God because he's perfect, right? If handled insensitively. Now, I do want to push back on one thing, which is animal suffering. And this is why the theist struggles to engage with this. Within our own internal coherence, and I understand, I believe Alex is a vegan, so this might rub him the wrong way. Christians are tasked within Scripture to rule over animals and tend and keep what God has created. So we're not to cause extinction level events, right? We're not to torture animals. However, animals are separate from humanity within the internal coherence of Scripture, right? So keep in mind, I am talking, and I talk more about this in the next video to come, where I talk about in the next video to come out, I'm going to engage Alex's accusations that God basically signs off on slavery and genocide, and we're going to grapple with that. And I think we've got some good answers to that. However, and I'm excited for that video. But the point I want to make here is that you have to keep your critique internal. You can't take your external framework and weave it into this debate. There is a time to debate that, to talk about how to treat animals, whether or not we should eat meat and all of that. There's totally a place for it. I'm not saying it doesn't belong in discourse at all. What I'm saying is, for this argument, we've got to be very specific. You are accusing theists of internal incoherence, which is to mean when you take us within our own belief system, we violate our own standards, metrics, and logic. And within that, animal suffering is not compelling to us. We are to cut animals in half for like sacrifices. The point of the lamb, an innocent, spotless lamb that's done nothing wrong, and then we kill it and we put its blood over the mercy seat. Now, we've done away with animal sacrifice because Jesus was the final sacrifice, but that wasn't because we had any problem killing animals. We should humanely kill animals. They didn't torture the lamb. They didn't like break its legs and drag it through the streets, banging it on, the sides of buildings and then like horrifically kill it. They just, they slit its neck. It was supposed to be humane, but it did die and it was innocent. So to say that we Christians should be morally offended by animal suffering, that doesn't fit within our framework. It's not that we don't care. We do want to take care of animals. Seeing a wounded puppy is not good for anyone on any day. But when God creates a global flood and he saves 2 of every kind, and then the rest of the animal kingdom is just wiped out, Christians are like, yeah, it was bad. We don't like it's sad for all those animals. Thank God we saved 2 of every kind so they can repopulate. But we weren't really bothered by the death of all those animals. So it's not internally incoherent with us to point out animal suffering and say, well, what about the deer? We would say, well, that deer doesn't have a soul, that it's mimicking life, but it lacks the ruach. It lacks the breath of God. And so that's why we humans are special. Enter Christopher Hitchens to now come and accuse me of arrogance, right? and maybe well warranted, but it's baked within the belief system, so it's not internally incoherent. We're all fine with this, and whether that makes us horrible or not, maybe it does. But that's an external framework. It's not a critique within this framework. So to try and bring in animal suffering, like we're supposed to hold God accountable for that, it doesn't work with the theist, and I think that's worth settling on. And I'm sorry that might be triggering to a vegan or anyone who cares about animal rights. And I do care about animal rights. I think what they do in chicken farms and watching the Food Inc. documentary was horrifying. I think we should take care of animals, right? However, so all that to be said, right? All the caveats. I got to be careful there to hit all the caveats. But I hope I'm getting across the reason why animal suffering is not compelling to the theist, and we don't really engage you on that ground because we don't share your framework within your specific moral standard for that. We just don't see that in Scripture. It's not taught to us, so we don't share it. So it's not internally incoherent, okay? I've spent a good few minutes just on saying that alone. Okay, so when it comes to animal suffering, natural disasters, disease, evolutionary cruelty, yes, he can struggle to engage with young Earth creationists, classical theists, and Molinists or others. But his real issue is just going to be that we don't see animal suffering as an issue. So he's got to keep it to human suffering. And every time people go human suffering, he reframes it back to animal suffering. I've watched him do this, and he'll say, "What about the deer?" And it doesn't compute with us, and it's not going to fit within our framework. That's your framework, and I get that's important to you. But yeah, like you gotta go back to human suffering, and there we do get to say that there's some transformative soul work happening, that we're refined through that. And ultimately, what I'll get to in my final refutation of this is an eschatological approach to this. Alex is coming at this from a naturalistic lens. So, you're born, you die, and that's it for him. To the theist, we are born, We exist for a short temporary time, and then we go off to eternity. And the teachings of Jesus are framed this way. He says, don't worry about that which kills the body, worry about that who can kill the soul and deliver it over to hellfire. Hebrews tells us to live as foreigners on this earth, as citizens of a greater, better kingdom, welcoming it afar off, right? So we're to run our race like an Olympian. So we don't really care about trying to fit everything within a naturalistic framework to make everything justified within our lifetime. We're taking an eschatological approach to it. We're taking a view of eternity. And so that's why we're not gonna try to justify something's life from the moment it's born to the moment it dies. It doesn't have an eschatological framework to justify that within. So gratuitous suffering is incompatible with omnibenevolence. Point number 4. Gratuitous suffering is incompatible with omnibenevolence. So if any, this is where the philosophical weight sits. If any suffering lacks justification, i.e. it's gratuitous, then it contradicts omnibenevolence. And that's why we got to look at what is gratuitous. Alex's challenge, just if I say a deer slowly burning to death in a forest fire over 6 hours, what moral good justifies that? What about the animal? And so theists' responses like, we can't know God's reasons, so that's skeptical theism. All suffering is justified in the grand scheme, the greater good defense. God respects natural law / free will too much to intervene. Alex typically exposes these as either hollow or morally troubling, leading into emotional analogies that reframe God as negligent at best. And this is also something I've heard Hitchens say. Hitchens goes more cosmological with it, where he's been like, look at all like the galaxies dying. And we're like, okay, but there's knowing in that galaxy. Now he's going to hold a cosmological naturalistic stance where there could be life all over the place. The theist holds that the cosmological like special stance where it's all about us. And again, Hitchens says, how arrogant are you to think that, right? And again, he can throw that at us, but it doesn't mean that we are internally incoherent, which is what this is testing. This is testing, does gratuitous suffering violate the fact that there can be an omnibenevolent God, right? So I'm going to get into my special refutation of all of this. I've been hitting just kind of more like broad brush theism, and none of this is new, but Alex is not interested in these. And when I say not interested, I mean specifically, he doesn't find this compelling. And I would say that because he hasn't shifted his stance. He hears these all the time, and he still considers this an S-tier debate accusation against God. So he's heard everything I've said. He's heard before. He's had presented to him, and it doesn't move him. It doesn't shift him, and he thinks it's still a great argument. So I want to get into why he can struggle to get good answers from theists, and when he does get good answers, why he struggles to integrate them logically for himself. So we have science versus philosophy. Now we're going to get into psychologizing Alex, which is troubling ground. I admit that. You always got to take this with a grain of salt, but I'm going to try and be super fair here because I think it's important. Alex is first and foremost an Oxford philosopher, and it shows. That's why in conversations with theist scientists such as Dr. Francis Collins, they can struggle to engage him on the philosophical field. But while Alex is a philosopher at heart, he's also a staunch naturalist, so much so that he struggles to apply theology and eschatological implications, okay? And I've heard Alex take a moment to verbalize eschatological objections, but he doesn't really engage on that ground. He's like, of course. And then he moves on, and then he doesn't focus on them, and then he brings it to animals. So he'll switch to arguments from science when engaging philosophers like Dr. William Lane Craig, who focus more on the metaphysical Kalam and the eschatological answers. Or he'll get linguistically evasive, and we'll get to that, how I saw that with him and Dr. Craig. He's also postmodern in his deconstructive reasoning. So much so he calls himself violently agnostic, and I would say, this is not him, but I would say in a Huxleyan sense, which is the Huxleyan sense would say that I'm agnostic in that I am a naturalist first and foremost, and you have to give me a good reason to believe anything that I can't empirically verify, right? I think Huxley said, no one has any right to claim that they know anything that they can't scientifically prove, which is scientism, it's empiricism. And so it's not agnosticism in its truest form of just epistemic humility, like I don't know. It makes a stance of naturalism, assumed naturalism. No one can know, therefore I'm a naturalist. And so he also struggles to stick with the right framework or field for the reasoning he's receiving. He begins to chew at these problems with his postmodern mind instead of walking them to the conclusions of the answer he's receiving. Instead of seeking to clarify the opposing view, let me hear you correctly. You're saying he begins to rebuttal using either philosophy against science or arguments from science against philosophy. And I saw this with Dr. Craig when they were arguing the Kalam. I've seen this in other areas where he's receiving theistic answers. Saw this most recently in his in the historicity of the cross with William Lane Craig, or in God approves of slavery in his debate with Ben Shapiro. He kind of has like a list of objections. And a good one was the Kalam with Dr. William Lane Craig. He tries to get in over here. This will be my little sphere of knowledge. He tries to pick at it from over here. Dr. Lane Craig gives an amazing refutation of his points. And instead of stopping to really think about what has just been refuted and to internalize it and to alter the coherence of his argument, he abandons it and he comes over here. Okay, let me get in over here. Well, Dr. Craig refutes that too. And instead of internalizing it, instead of sitting on the answer you just got, well, he comes over here. Okay, well, Dr. Craig refutes that as well. And Alex doesn't stop to listen to the refutation. He kind of gets, okay, I tried to get in. I can't get in. Let's move on. And it's like a cat pawing at a ball of yarn. It just kind of like, scratching it a little bit and kicking it around, but never making anything out of the yarn. I don't know where that metaphor was going. So let's get into some of these sentences that I have, these accusations. Alex is first and foremost an Oxford philosopher, and it shows. So I would say his clarity of thought, precision with definitions, and rhetorical restraint reflect rigorous training. He's not a populist YouTuber with flashy style. He follows analytic philosophical method, especially in formal debates. He thinks in syllogism, weighs premises, and seeks internal consistency, at least within his own naturalistic scope. I think he struggles to remain within the internal consistency of what he's questioning. And so this is why scientists like Francis Collins can struggle to debate him. They rely on empirical data or personal testimony, but Alex keeps dragging the conversation back into metaphysical structure, which, I keep using Dr. Collins. He's the most recent one I saw. He really struggled to even understand the premise of what Alex was saying. That doesn't mean Dr. Collins was ignorant or dumb or anything. It means that it wasn't in his field of speciality, and his brain doesn't work that way. It's almost like Pascal talked about. There are some minds that are mathematical and some minds that are intuitive, and then there's some minds that are both and some minds that are neither, which he called the dull mind. But it's almost like Alex was trying to engage the intuitive mind in a Pascalian sense, and Dr. Collins is a mathematical mind in the Pascalian sense, right? And so he struggled to understand where Alex was coming from. And Alex struggled to engage him where he could be engaged. So he's also a staunch naturalist. He struggles to apply theology or eschatology. And so he frames suffering and design questions entirely within closed naturalistic systems. He wants the theist to justify suffering as if there's no afterlife. But he's using this to critique the worldview of those who believe in an afterlife, or eschatology. So he needs to respect metaphysical eschatology. So his metaphysics is effectively materialist, even if he entertains ideas like panpsychism or determinism. When someone presents theological responses like divine hiddenness or redemptive suffering or resurrection hope, eschatological frameworks, right? All shall be made right in the end. this kind of redemption, theology, he often seems philosophically tone deaf to them, not because he rejects them outright, but because he doesn't engage on their terms. Instead of asking what would follow if this eschatological vision were true, he pivots back to how do we verify or falsify such claims, epistemology over teleology. So I've never seen Alex approach, and maybe I haven't seen enough of his videos, right? Maybe you guys need to link me something to go watch, but I've never seen him effectively test the internal coherence of a worldview that allows for eschatology. He always wants us to justify the suffering of the here and now, and Christians specifically do not have a here and now worldview. In fact, we're trained against it. So we're supposed to make the most of this life. We're supposed to do justice, love mercy, walk humbly before our God. But we're supposed to, right, for those who find themselves a slave, remain as you were, right? God would want you to be free, but be the best slave you can be if you can't be free, And so there is a sense within the Christian that, hey, if you're dealt a bad hand in life, God wouldn't say it this way, but suck it up, buttercup, be the best Christian you can with that terrible life. There's a good example too of Christians who are wrongfully imprisoned. And then they'll say, God is using me to do so much good in prison that they struggle to wish for freedom because they now have a ministry within the prison that brings them meaning to their life. So they're not worried about the suffering they're going through because they're grappling with the fact that their suffering brings them inherent meaning and purpose. So he calls himself violently agnostic. I add in a Huxleyan sense. I haven't heard him say that, but this reflects his postmodern bent. He likes to present himself as someone who refuses to overstate certainty, who believes the limits of knowledge are more extensive than many people admit. But there's a point where skepticism stops being a tool that we use, and it starts being the whole worldview. Instead of using devil's advocacy, postmodern deconstructionism, instead of using this postmodern toolkit to kind of test the validity of a worldview, it becomes just a place where you live. And there is an element, I'm not going to accuse Alex of intellectual dishonesty. I've heard enough of him speak, and I do not think Alex is being purposefully intellectually dishonest. But I will say that when you use postmodern tools to deconstruct worldviews as hard as you can, then you are relegated to only being a devil's advocate, and you cannot engage in good faith in a way that you're going to listen and internalize what you're hearing. And that's what I see with him. I see him just postmodernize the heck, just try to deconstruct the heck out of arguments. And when he gets just a sea of amazing answers, he doesn't ever really listen to the answers. He moves on to the next objection. So this can also reveal a methodological inconsistency. He wields epistemic humility as a sword when it serves skepticism. We can't know. I need data. Where's the empirical weight in this? But he doesn't extend that same humility when dismissing theistic frameworks with confidence. So what I see, and I'm wondering if I worded that correctly on my slide there, but what I'm really getting at is Alex doesn't hold his own views with the same sort of skepticism. At the end of the Kalam argument, Alex admits that his view is radical. Him and Dr. Craig both agree that it comes with a very high intellectual price tag. And he's like, I think I've realized that. And although he said that 4 years ago, I haven't seen him shift. It's almost like he's like, yeah, my intellectual price tag is way higher than theism. I'll keep it. And he'd prefer to stay a skeptic in that sense. And so at what point do you start being skeptical of the fact that you've adopted an intellectually high price tag? I mean, when we get to some of his stances on nihilism, it's like Alex can't even prove that he himself exists. Language has just devolved into a word soup. And it plays this kind of linguistic catch me if you can instead of actually talking to anyone about anything meaningful. So I'll break that down with a point by point, with a Kalam argument that I show my notes on here. He struggles to stay within the right field, switching between science and philosophy. In debates with William Lane Craig, he responds to metaphysical claims like the Kalam or moral ontology with empirical objections, missing that William Lane Craig is operating on modal logic, not physical models. I would also refine that a little bit from the time that I wrote these notes, because I took some time to listen to some more debates from him. I would say it's not just empirical. I think that Alex can do a good job getting metaphysical, but it's the framework he struggles to stay in, and he begins to deconstruct so far the question that we're asking that words lose all of their meaning, right? When we get to the point that nothing really exists, and you can't know anything, then you can't even know the words you're saying, and some atheists like Alex Rosenberg are okay with that. They're like, yeah, words mean nothing, including the sentence I'm saying. So in debates with scientists, he might switch to moral philosophy or semantic issues as if category error automatically refutes their claim. So this framework hopping can sound clever to audiences that are unfamiliar with proper categorization of argument types, but to the trained interlocutors, it's a dodge. So when you switch the framework of what you're testing, you at some point you stop asking, are you internally coherent? And you just begin to ask, does your God fulfill my own emotional framework? Which is a fine question you can ask, but it's worth knowing that you left the debate you were having and you're starting a brand new debate. So it's almost like we got to time out, hold on. Do you realize you're no longer testing my internal coherence? You're testing to see if the internal coherence we found satisfies you emotionally, right? Or even morally. But yeah, so you've got to stay within internal coherence. You can't frame shift. And that's what I noticed that he does. And that's going to get in the way of maybe him hearing is what I'm trying to get at. I think when he does this, the only one who is hurt from it is his audience and himself. The person he's debating doesn't really lose anything from the conversation, but they don't really gain anything from the conversation. I do have people strawman me on purpose sometimes because I want to see how my arguments can be strawmanned. So, there's some, not that Alex is doing that, but when you framework shift, it can head that direction. There can be some use to test that, but I thought we just wanted to have a good conversation, right? And that's how he comes across in his podcast. Hey, I just want to have a good conversation. I prefer his podcast more than formal debate. Alex Rosenberg pointed that out when he debated William Lane Craig. He's like, I don't like this debate structure. He's like, I wish we could just talk. And I agreed. I wish they could have removed all the debate, put out, 2 chairs and just handed each one of them a microphone and some coffee, right? So anyways, instead of clarifying the opposing view, he launches rebuttals across categories. This is what we've been talking about, but my notes have more here. So he often responds quickly, and not by steel manning the opponent's point, but by immediately searching for vulnerabilities, often in the form of a reductio ad absurdum, a redefinition of the field, or a shift into his preferred epistemic turf. And this is what I was getting to at like a cat pawing at a ball of yarn. When I watch him talk about the historicity of the cross or the Kalam, he goes over here, he gets refuted. Well, then he goes over here and he gets refuted. Then he goes over here and he gets refuted. And he goes over here and he gets refuted. And it's like, when will you just stop and sit in some of this tension, right? That the moment you felt tension, it's almost like he has this notebook and of the next thing he wants to bring up, and he's almost lost interest with the fact that he's been defeated, or he almost expected to be defeated, and it was just like a means to an end. He's like, what do you think of this? Yeah, okay, heard all that before. What do you think about this, right? And I'd like to hear him just more engage with what he just heard. What are the implications of what he just heard? How does that internally affect his own framework, right? So this habit is part of what I think is his debate strategy, but it comes at the cost of true dialectic. He tends not to say, let me restate your view in my own words to make sure I understand it, which would be the Socratic, truly philosophical move. Instead, he tends to use the opponent's words as raw material for a pivot. And again, this can sound like I'm accusing of intellectual dishonesty, and I'm not meaning to, though to me it can come across that way. I don't believe Alex is intellectually dishonest. I think he's a predator. I think he's sharp. I think he's a linguistic killer. I think he's smart. He's sharp. He's honed. And I think maybe he needs to let some of that killer instinct die at some point so he can have more of a true dialectic. I think his skepticism and his postmodernism have become his natural language. So instead of saying, let me hear, he's going to say, let me deconstruct, right? So this is a breakdown of the Kalam. These are my notes that I've kind of typed up. Just take me off the screen for a sec. So we see in this conversation with William Lane Craig, when discussing the Kalam, Alex first accepts the structure of the Kalam. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. He challenges God's timeless agency. Well, if God created the universe, there must be a moment when he chose to do so. Craig responds, well, God's choice is timeless and simultaneous with creation. Again, you should watch the full thing if you want to get a really good breakdown. But these are my notes, and I'm telling you, I would pause the video, rewind it, have it play again. I would write things out. I would take time to meditate and journal on some of the stuff. So I wish everyone would engage with that same spirit, right? And some of my people in my comments have done that. They're like, I've listened multiple times, I've rewinded, and it's cool to see people grapple with that. I think that's truly Socratic. But anyways. Then he questions God entering time. Well, how can a timeless being begin to act in time? Craig answers, God enters time at the moment of creation. His act is explanatorily prior, not temporally prior, right? So he's prior in explanation. He's not prior in terms of like time. When we say God, before everything there was God. Well, there was no before, so you can't say that. It's illogical. Well, no, explanatorily we can. And Dr. Craig does a good job of breaking this all out. He's got a whole equation for it, and the t equals 0, right? So this shifts focus to the definition of beginning to exist. So then Alex starts to take apart just the fact that the question was asked to begin with. So Alex says, do things really begin to exist, or are we just labeling arrangements of matter, right? And this is a tease to the Mereological nihilism that's going to come out here in a second, but he begins to head this direction. And I don't know if Alex knew this beforehand. It seemed like he did when it came out. It would have been nice to just define that at the beginning, say, hey, here's the stance I'm coming from. But anyways, it's almost like he forced Dr. Craig to uncover it. And Dr. Craig was like, well, he's like, but that's Mereological nihilism, and it's like, oh, you found me. So I don't know, maybe he wouldn't describe himself that way and then found him. I don't know. It seemed pretty easy for him to be like, yes, that's what I am. Anyways, he introduces quantum mechanics and the vacuum, suggests particles can appear without cause. And I would say Alex didn't really suggest that. He referenced that people suggest that, implying first premise may be flawed. But Craig rebuttals anyways. Quantum events still involve a quantum field. This is not nothing. Then Alex challenges composite object existence, right? And this is where we get into Mereological nihilism, which I'll break down more here in just a second. But this argues that what we call humans or chairs are just matter arranged in certain ways. He says these objects don't begin to exist in any meaningful sense. Well, that's not the premise of the Kalam. Alex struggled to understand this in the video itself, from what it seemed. But then when he had his follow-up video of debunking himself, it seemed like he expressed this more truly. But I never saw, again, although he expressed it better in the follow-up video, I haven't seen in the 4 years since he encountered this any shift in his logical coherence. It's almost like he thinks being a Mereological nihilist is fine. So he redefines existence as a semantic categorization. Claims we label changes, but no real entity begins to exist. This attempts to dissolve the argument through language games, not by refuting the premise. And again, this is where, for me as a viewer, I got a little frustrated because it felt like linguistic catch me if you can. It seemed like he was losing. He tried a bunch of refutations. Again, the cat with the yarn. Here it didn't work. Here it didn't work. Here it didn't work. Here it didn't work. And then it's almost as if linguistically it triggered a flight response in him psychologically, where he just started to run from words and definition and hide in this wood of language soup. So Craig finally identifies the metaphysical shift, names Alex's position as Mereological nihilism or nihilism. I say nihilism. I think it's because I played Mass Effect and they had a character named Nihilus. But the belief that composite objects don't exist. He clarifies, even if you believe only particles exist, the Kalam still applies to those particles, right? So you'd say, well, when those began to exist, there's where the Kalam, can finally meet your worldview. Alex admits that his view is radical, concedes that only fundamental particles begin to exist, effectively undermines realism in common sense ontology, right? Because now that he's acknowledged that, you can't say he doesn't believe in God alone. He doesn't believe in the universe. He doesn't believe in himself. So Craig accuses Alex of anti-realism. You think we construct reality rather than discover it. And notes that this move is not a counter-argument. It's a philosophical escape hatch. And this is coming from Craig himself in the debate. And I was like, yeah, this is what I was seeing. I was so glad that Dr. Craig called that out, because it felt like trying to get a cat in the bath, you know? It kind of felt like he was trying to like pin him down and be like, get in the water. You know, here's the logical implication of your worldview. And it's like, I don't want it. And so Alex is a self-ascribed Mereological nihilist. Now, again, Dr. Craig pointed it out, but it seemed like he adopted that definition, or maybe even had that definition priorly, and was just waiting for Dr. Craig to discover it. This is the philosophical view that there are no composite objects, meaning nothing has proper parts. It posits that only mereological simples, objects without any parts, exist. In essence, things like tables, chairs, and even atoms as we commonly understand them are not considered to exist according to this view. Instead, only fundamental building blocks, simples, exist and are arranged in various ways. So this means Alex, as I said before, doesn't just disbelieve God. Alex doesn't believe he himself exists. He doesn't even believe the universe exists. And so at this point, nothing's real. It's this kind of anti-realist escape hatch that either he believes, and I don't know how you could live with that belief. Like, I don't know how that belief is livable. I don't know how you could go about your life thinking that you yourself don't actually exist. Then again, I feel determinism, which Alex is a staunch proponent of, is livable either. You can't really live a life where you think everything's determined. In fact, actually, I get into this either in this video or the next. It's in these notes, either these notes or the next notes. But that's pathologized in psychology. To lean on a deterministic worldview, we would on the psychological side of things call that avoidance behavior, right? To say that I'm not culpable for my own actions. It's all determined. And I'm not saying that Alex believes that. In fact, I'm saying I don't think Alex can believe that. And that's why I think it's unlivable. I think that's why Alex himself admitted that this is a radical view and comes with a high price tag. You know, Dr. Craig said, well, the beautiful thing of what you're doing is you're showing non-believers in the Christian sense, the implications of their non-belief. Just it comes with a high intellectual price tag that I struggle to see how someone could adopt that price tag and then with a straight face call themselves rational or logical. So in summary, my view of Alex is that philosophically he's highly trained and analytically sharp, but he slips in a postmodern deconstruction mid-argument, and he rests in Mereological nihilism, which means you can't really have any. It is skepticism as a worldview. It is skepticism as a badge of honor. And it can't really be engaged with. In fact, it almost takes pride in being ephemeral and not being able to be engaged with. And it's almost like I had this student who used to bug the heck out of me. It was one of my best students and became one of my best friends. And when I say student, I mean when I was an intern at a youth group. But he would always play devil's advocate. And so we'd argue for like 2 hours, and then it would turn out he didn't even believe what he was saying. He's like, "Oh, I was just playing devil's advocate." I'm like, "Oh, that's frustrating, because here I thought you were an idiot," because he would say the most nonsensical things, and I'd be like, "How is this teenager coming to these conclusions and drawing breath?" You know? But turns out he didn't actually believe him. He just loved playing devil's advocate, and I would say that if you're not careful, postmodern deconstruction mid-argument just becomes devil's advocacy and intellectually ephemeral. You're not really trying to gain knowledge. You want to pick apart your opponent, and if you can't, then you've wasted your time, but you're never going to learn anything. Scientifically, I'd say he leverages science fluently, but he misapplies science to philosophical premises. So my issue is not with My issue is not with any of his scientific leanings where he leans on the science of it. My issue is where he applies it. Naturalism, I think he's consistent and clear within his own framework of naturalism, but I think he dismisses theological categories without sufficient internal critique. So I think he could take eschatology more serious when it comes to testing the internal coherency of a framework that is a theist framework. I think his debate style, he's calm, he's precise, he's effective, but he rarely seeks to deeply understand the theist responses on their own terms. And this is why I think he can sit with brilliant people and not change his stance in any bit. And that's how it comes across to me. Because when I see something 4 years apart, and it's like, here he was 4 years ago, here he is, 8 months ago, and there's no change in his stance. Why? Why is he still bringing up the same arguments when all of them were refuted? He found no way in. I'd at least expect him to reframe the argument to find better purchase. But instead, he makes the same argument in almost every video to almost every theologian. And when he gets a good refutation of them, he doesn't go back to the drawing board and just come up with a better accusation. At least that's what I'd like, sharpen the argument. So now I'm going to go through his 6 points, and we're going to keep the right category on track. So as a reminder, his 6 points were for the argument from evil. Again, he considers this S tier. Number 1, if God exists, he's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Premise number 2, God is the creator of all contingent reality, including the metaphysical laws that govern the universe. Premise number 3, these laws necessarily give rise to immense and widespread suffering, including natural evils, disease, natural disasters, predation, evolutionary cruelty. Premise number 4, many instances of this suffering are gratuitous. They serve no greater good and are not logically necessary for free will, soul-making, or moral development. Premise number 5, an omnibenevolent God would not choose to create a reality structured such that gratuitous suffering necessarily results. Premise number 6, therefore, the existence of gratuitous suffering is strong evidence against the existence of omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. So 6 points. It sucks that we're at an hour already. I already recorded this video once. It was a good time. It's a good time frame. But I was way too fast, too many which I already struggle with. And when I'm on a time constraint, I and way more, and it gets annoying. I listen back to my videos many times to test my own internal coherency. And I can really bug myself with some of my linguistic faux pas. So I had to slow down, and because I had to slow down, the video is longer. Sorry about that. This should almost be a whole nother video, but we've worked our whole way up to this argument. Maybe I could have got here quicker, but I think it would have been at the cost of explanatory power. And then I get all these comments, well, you don't blah, blah, blah. And it's like, well, and then I get 2 comments. Like, you didn't explain this enough, and the other is your videos are too long. I know, I'm sorry. It's like you can't have one without the other. All right, number 1, if God exists, he's omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent. Yeah, I agree. No objection, and no one should object to that. Premise number 2, God is the creator of all contingent reality, including metaphysical laws that govern this universe. Physics, biology, causality. I agree. No objection. That follows omnipotence just fine. Premise number 3. Here's where we're going to start refuting. These laws necessarily give rise to immense and gratuitous suffering. Okay. So I would reframe this with Genesis chapter 1 and 2, right? I would propose Genesis as metaphysical commentary, not just mythic narrative, right? So metaphysical commentary. We theists have a very strong metaphysical sense. So we need to keep, if you're going to judge this on internal coherence, you need to keep in mind that metaphysical reality is more real than the natural physical world to us theists. Right. So the claim is that the laws of suffering, predation, death, futility are not original to the cosmos as God intended it, but are consequences of an ontological rupture, what Genesis describes as the fall. Okay, so God created the world, and behold, it was very good. Yet God created man with free will, imparted the imago Dei and the ruach, the breath of God, and basically handed man the keys to the kingdom, to creation, to agency and autonomy. In this light, God creates a very good world with potential for relational harmony, not mechanical cruelty, right? So the world Alex says that God should be able to create God did create. There was one problem God did, though. He put humans in that world who he gave free will. And so the fall introduces metaphysical distortion, not just moral guilt. Thorns, pain in childbirth, futility, and predation. If you really get to the curse of Genesis chapter 3, it is broken relationship with the world, where we get all the natural evil. It is broken relationship with God, where we get all of the sin behavior. And it's broken relationship with each other, which is where we're going to get war and murder and bloodshed and all that kind of stuff. So we broke our relationship to the world, to God, and to nature. Or I already said that. To the world, to God, and to each other. And so, therefore, the structure of suffering that Alex critiques is not God's intended order. So it's the consequence of autonomy from God. So God gave us free will, and that created all of these problems that he gave us free will. And that's where we're going to rest with this, is that Alex's real issue is not with God, it's with free will when he's testing the internal coherence of this, right? He can't, when testing the internal coherence, it's got to rest upon an argument against free will. Well, then God was wrong to give humans free will because it will lead to suffering. So in other words, you're evaluating a broken world as if it were God's prototype, right? So don't look at the world as it is now and accuse God for it. You would have to look at the world as described by Scripture, which was very good. The lion laid with the lamb, right? Everything was a vegetarian. There was no death. And yet God gave humans free will. Right. So we screwed it all up. We participated in creation and we ruined it. So this shifts the burden of explanation back. Now, Alex must explain why the fall narrative isn't sufficient metaphysical grounding for natural evil. And I've never seen Alex engage this way. And again, this is eschatology. This is metaphysical commentary within Genesis. So the theist absolutely believes these things. This is not just poetry to us, unless you're Jordan Peterson. And even then, it's hard to peg down where he really stands on this. But we believe these things. So we believe God created the world, and behold, it was very good. And then humanity was given autonomy, the keys to the kingdom, and we screwed it up. That's like the whole point. In fact, the gospel can be framed in the genealogy of Noah. When you translate the names, it's man appointed mortal sorrow, blessed God shall come down. His death brings despairing rest, the rest we're so desperate for. So man appointed mortal sorrow, right? Blessed God shall come down, Jesus, right? His death, the cross, shall bring the rest and the restoration that we're so desperate for. So that's the gospel right there. So if you're going to critique God, you have to keep the gospel as the core of your framework. And so these laws necessarily give rise to immense and gratuitous suffering. To continue to refute this, most apologists handle this poorly, and I think we can do better. But here's how to anticipate Alex's pushbacks. Isn't the fall just a myth? Well, regardless of genre that it's written in, it functions as a metaphysical diagnosis, a symbolic account of cosmic disorder. So even a Jordan Peterson-esque theist, who I wouldn't call necessarily, he wouldn't call himself Christian, it seems, right? But would just say, well, even so, this is symbolically how we give account to this God. Now, I still think that falls apart if you treat it as just symbolism and myth. I think it has to be metaphysical commentary, right? And metaphysical within reality. So, and your problem is with cosmic disorder. So, but at least we can frame it as your problem's with cosmic disorder, and it answers cosmic disorder, right? No internal incoherency. God still created the system knowing the fall would happen. Yes, but foreknowledge is not the same as causation. A surgeon knows a patient will suffer during healing. The suffering doesn't prove malevolence. It reveals the cost of freedom and recovery. So God, through giving autonomy, through giving us free will, was building within us something far greater than the cost of the suffering itself. And so to say, therefore the suffering is not gratuitous. It's immense, but it's not gratuitous. And the suffering there has a reason for it, right? So when I go to the gym and I work out, I could do that a lot better, let's be honest. But when I do that, it sucks to work out. But through the suffering I'm causing myself, I'm building something better within me. So I'm tearing down my muscle fibers so they will build back up better. So the suffering I endure is for a purpose. It's not gratuitous. then why not create a world where the fall is impossible? Because that world would lack what you already treasure: love freely chosen, meaning forged in adversity, the dignity of moral agency. And that's why the suffering is not gratuitous. It can be immense, but it's not gratuitous. God knew when he gave us his breath, God knew when he gave us his image, the creativity, right, to be autonomous, that we would use that creativity incorrectly, and we would need to be trained in that. And so I bring this up later, but I'll say it now as well. The same reason God should not step in the way and remove our autonomy is the same reason why I, as a father, shouldn't devour my children in a Jungian sense, right? I shouldn't become the devouring father and stop my kids from doing everything to try and keep them safe, because in doing so, I will devour them, I will hurt them, I will harm them. They need freedom to act, to have agency, to have culpability in their decisions, right, when they do something. So I can hold them responsible for that. I can punish them for bad choices. But it's it's a soft libertarian free will, right? You can do whatever you want within reason, right? I still get to punish you. I still get to ground you because I'm cultivating a morality within you. So I bring this up more in the next video where it talks about where we talk about slavery, where I'm gonna go into that. But I talk about how the classical Jewish take on that, rabbinic take on that, is that Jews spent time in slavery so that they can have sympathy for those that they take into slavery. But we'll get into that video when we get into that video. I'd like to quote Lewis here: God whispers in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I've wrestled as a father who has gone through a lot of trauma, a lot of pain, a lot of hard prices to be paid in life. And they've built within me character in the letter of James sense, right? They've had their perfect work, and they've built within me a tried and proven character. And I want to impart onto my children that same character, but I'm also grappling with, well, how do I do it without it having to be tried and proven, which implies tension, stress, suffering, right? I don't want my kids to suffer gratuitously, but in life they will probably suffer immensely, and with that, I want to help them grapple with immense suffering, not run away from it. And so, and also trust its work, that although I didn't choose it, I don't want it, that in their own suffering that they naturally find, it will build within them a perfect work, a strong character. So the real problem isn't evil, it's free will. And it's funny that Alex has a lot of videos on determinism, like why you're not free and why you don't have choices. So Alex's real presuppositional battle is with free will, not theodicy per se, because the issue of all this is God did create the world Alex wanted. The world Alex is saying that God can create, God did create. The problem is it was all ruined when God allowed free will. So Alex would call that a mistake. Free will is a mistake. And we would say, no, it's a blessing, right? And so Alex sees suffering not as a mystery of love, but as a flaw in design, because he doesn't believe we're meaningful agents in this story. And that really comes from his take on determinism anyways. I think Alex struggles to really grapple with why determinism is not a livable worldview. I don't think he engages with it in a real way. So before we put God on trial for the existence of suffering, shouldn't we first ask whether humans are morally significant beings who can meaningfully suffer or choose at all? And again, Alex would deny that he himself exists, that a human being is even a thing. So that's really where he's got to grapple with this, not necessarily on this theodicy that we're grappling with. So if we're determined cogs in a system, then gratuitous suffering isn't evil. It's irrelevant, right? And so some people use Libet's free will experiment, which is, right, he did this test where if you raise your arm and flex your wrist, that cognitively you did all that before you were even consciously aware of it. Your body did it before you knew. So they use this to argue against free will, but even Libet believed in what was called the free won't right? It doesn't disprove free will. It reframes it as pre-conscious readiness potentials initiating action. So we still have a conscious veto power intervening before execution. And this is what Libet called the free won't. So if someone says, raise your hand and flex your wrist, yes, my body will do that before my consciousness writes a story about it. But someone can also say, raise your arm and flex your wrist. And I could say, no, I won't, right? Captain America, I don't think I will. So we still have the option of free won't, which I would say also implies free will, right? So that veto power is what modern psychology affirms. Not full libertarian freedom, but morally and psychologically significant agency. Oh, and my note is on here. Good, I thought so. The whole field of therapy, recovery, and trauma work depends on the belief that we can choose a different path, right? So, in fact, psychology sees rejection of agency as pathological, not noble. That's avoidance behavior. And I got into this in my agnosticism. I touched a little bit of this on my agnosticism, the fallacy of I don't know. So the key philosophical pivot here is the debate isn't whether we're uncaused, it's whether we're co-authors in the story of our lives, capable of resisting our conditioning, of acting from conscience rather than compulsion. So this must be settled before we can ever ask, was God right to give us freedom, right? So do you even have free will? Okay, once we deal with you accept that we have free will, then was God right to give us freedom? All of these are presuppositions that will invade the framework that you're testing with your own framework that's going to overlap. And so now you're no longer actually asking a coherent question. It's blended with all of this other stuff. So we've got to reduce the variables of our experiment so we can test it appropriately. So I'm going to call this is my own term. I haven't heard this anywhere else, but the eighth day. A theology of broken design. So I make my own personal case that we have basically an eighth day of creation. The idea that God created the world and it was very good on day 6. So technically it's a 7th day of creation because on the actual 7th day he rested. So that wasn't a day of creation. But 8th day avoids having to explain that, which I just explained. So I guess that was pointless. But anyways, the 8th day, a theology of broken design. Now we shift where most apologists might fear to tread. Genesis as a metaphysical lens, not myth or moral fable. I'm proposing a theological retroactivity of the fall, right? So God created a complete and harmonious world. Behold, it was very good. Man's rebellion, Genesis 2 and 3, wasn't just disobedience, it fractured the metaphysical architecture of creation. That rupture wasn't merely future-facing, though. It echoed backwards, distorting what had been created whole. Well, what I might call, the 8th day. The day the world was remade not forward, but downward. I'm going to use a Mosaic reframe here in a moment. But the idea is that when God tells Moses to put his hand into his coat and pull it out, and it's a leprous hand, my point is if you were to cut off that hand and evaluate the leper's hand scientifically, you'd say, yeah, this hand, obviously is a hand that somewhere in this human's lifetime he contracted leprosy, and it has since eaten away the cartilage at his hand to the point where it's deformed. And you'd be like, scientifically that follows, but miraculously, no. Moses put his hand into his coat and pulled it out, and behold, leprosy. Same way I use another argument, not in here, but I was explaining this to someone where I was saying, when Jesus created bread and fish, if someone were to take that piece of bread, go to a scientist and say, where did this bread come from? The scientist would say, well, based on my scientific analysis of this piece of bread, it appears that someone planted grain in the ground, that it grew, someone threshed the wheat, grind it down into meal, back into flour, and added, some water and turned it into bread. And you're like, scientifically, that follows. However, miraculously, no. This bread just came out of nowhere, yet it has implied age within it. So this is going to be explained a little bit more fuller here in a second, but this reframes natural evils, disease, predation, decay, existential angst, which is futility, entropy, morality, and psychological suffering, alienation, fear, disconnection, right? Anxieties, all that. Not as features of God's creations, but symptoms of creation's infection, right? So we broke it. And so the idea is what I made is I'm a young Earth creationist who's also an old Earth creationist, right? So I would say that the same way that God created a chicken and not an egg, right? That when God created things, he would have had to create a history for that thing. And that's not a problem for a God that's outside of time. We're going to get into that a little bit more. So things can be created with age. Just like when Jesus multiplied the loaves and the fishes, Jesus didn't make the loaves and fishes by creating caviar and then growing it, right, into fish and then cooking the fish. He created fish ready to eat. However, it was with implied age. If anyone were to take that fish or bread, they'd be like, "Oh, this bread or fish is a month old." It's like, no, it's not. It was just made, but it was created with age, right? So that's how I can get away with my own framework of being young Earth, but also old Earth. So I would say, I believe the Earth was created with age, right? And so, am I making this up? Am I the one just putting this forward and that I have no backing? No, actually, I'm among friends. So William Dembski, in The End of Christianity, 2009, argued that the effects of the fall could be retroactively applied to the history of the cosmos. Dembski says the fall is an event in time, but its consequences are retroactive, spreading both forward and backward to affect the entire cosmos. He uses this to explain natural evil in deep time, dinosaurs, suffering, and dying, and why God could create a world good that still has millions of years of death before Adam, right? So this is what we're getting to, evolutionary record. And so why could we see an evolutionary record of suffering if God created the world good before Homo sapien ever entered the gene pool? And we would say, well, that's because God or man's actions had metaphysical retroactive causality. And so this is a quote: God, by his omniscience, is able to arrange history in such a way that the consequences of the fall are felt retroactively. And this follows. Well, I'll have a full defense of this here in a moment. First, let me stay on this line of thought of, other people who are with me. So Boethius in Eternalism, 6th century, described God as existing outside of time, seeing all of history simultaneously. Like a man, viewing a parade. He could see the beginning, the end, the middle, all of it. If he's like in a hot air balloon. So if God is outside of time, he can orchestrate causal events that span forward and backwards, not as sequence, but as totality, right? Because he's outside of time. This use of retrocausality fits Boethian model of divine providence. I use this joke as an illustration. I tell this joke with my kids, to my 13-year-old son. His name is Liam. And I say, I'm a time traveler, or I can manipulate time. I had like the time stone, a little toy time stone from like the Infinity Gauntlet. And I said, I'm going to change time. I just changed time to where your name has always been Liam. He's like, it has always been Liam. I'm like, you would think that, right? And it's a joke. We laugh. The point is that if I change his name somewhere in time, to him, he would not know that I changed his name. Right. So it'd be like if I was making this joke to Alex, I'm like, okay, I changed your name. Your name is no longer, Robert O'Connor. It's Alex O'Connor. He's like, my name's always been Alex O'Connor. You'd think that, right? So if something happens with retrocausality temporally, you wouldn't know that anything was changed. You wouldn't know what the original timeline was unless someone wrote it down. As a huge Flash fan and read Flash comics, right? The Flash, he messes a lot with time. Eobard Thawne, Reverse Flash, messes up time. It's fascinating, but I think those kind of science fiction can help grapple with some of the metaphysical implications of temporal retrocausality. So, however, it's not just theologians. We have quantum retrocausality in the philosophy of physics. So in physics, some interpretations of quantum theory, time-symmetric formulations, allow for events in the future to affect the past. So philosophers who are well-respected, like the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy, Hugh Price, argue that causality is not strictly one way. So again, it's not just theologians where I could find friends with my wild take on temporal retrocausality. In fact, it's not wild, and I'm going to argue to why it's not wild. But let's get into some objections. I don't know if Alex would ever object this way. These are just me guessing what I might get in the comments. But That sounds mythic and anti-scientific. Well, it's metaphysical. Genesis isn't competing with evolutionary biology. It's explaining what evolution can't. Why sentient beings experience alienation from nature, not just struggle for survival. So you're saying humans broke the world backwards in time? I'm saying that time itself is a created thing. And theological causality doesn't need to follow Newtonian sequence. In a cosmos where God is the ground of being, the fall reorders the relationship between creation and creator all at once, not just linearly. So if we broke our relationship with God, then that broken relationship, if God is outside of time, then that broken relationship would be viewed in a temporal sense all across time because he's outside of time, yet we still have a relationship with him. So what about the evidence for evolution? Again, even if you affirm old Earth, nothing about, well, I don't like my note here, original. I'll read the original note and then I'll get better with it. My original note was, even if you affirm an old Earth, nothing about Darwinism explains moral horror. Survival of the fittest doesn't weep, but we do, and Genesis tells us why. We remember Eden. So that gets more into why we feel that this is wrong, like why Alex is okay to feel that like all of this evil and death and destruction and futility is out of place. I'm going to say, well, yeah, because you're supposed to remember Eden. But also, again, temporal retrocausality totally allows for evolutionary evidence throughout time in history, because we'd say, yes, we broke time. We broke the world across time with the fall. So the objection, what I would say to Alex is, your objection to gratuitous suffering assumes a world that should have been different. That's not a scientific conclusion. That's a moral memory. And Genesis affirms that memory by saying, you know what, Alex, you're right. It wasn't supposed to be this way. God did create something much better, and an omnipotent, omnibenevolent God would have created something much better. And what's interesting is that this is a modern thought you're having that ancient writers anticipated, either A, because it's true, or B, because they were just so ahead of their time. And so I would say, Alex, you're not wrong. There's a better design strategy. You're right. But you've been critiquing the wrong God. God isn't the flawed creator. We are. And why would God ever let us participate in this creation knowing it would cause so much suffering? For the same reason a mother mustn't become the devouring mother. Love breeds agency. It's the same reason why I want a puppy and not a robot dog from Radio Shack, right? It's another reason why men want a real girlfriend and not an AI girlfriend, right? It's why I want a child and not a baby doll. My children are messy and chaotic and can be rebellious, but they love me. And a baby doll, while it can sit in its place, I don't have to feed it. I don't have to take it on walks. Take it on walks. I went back to the dog analogy. Right. I don't have to feed it. I don't have to burp it. I don't have to change its diaper. It won't grow and it won't love. And so God wants love, just like I want love. And we are created in the image of God. So just as humanity yearns for true affection, God yearns for true affection, which can only come from agency, not from forced morality. So you could raise the objection, your theology implies retroactive causality, and that's absurd, right? Because now we're getting to wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff. But you're asking me to believe that human sin caused, he could say, you asked me to believe that human sin caused billions of years of evolutionary suffering and natural evil retroactively? Well, that's not only implausible, it's incoherent, you might say, that I'm positing a time travel theology. But let me defend that. My response, only if your God is time-bound. Mine isn't, and that's implicit in the very premise we're testing. If you're assuming God is inside time, like a cosmic engineer reacting to events as they happen, then yeah, retrocausality would be absurd. But that's not the God of classical theism, right? The God I'm talking about created time itself. He exists eternally, not just forever, but outside of chronological sequence. That means what we call before and after are not constraints to him. And this is baked into premise 1 and 2. It's baked into premise 1 and 2. So you can't really object it unless you're objecting the whole premise from the moment you posited it, which is to beg the question, right? So from this vantage, the fall isn't a point in time. It's a fracture in being, and that fracture radiates both backwards and forward across created time. So this already, again, I asked if I was among friends with this, and I showed, but also Scripture, it's all in there from the beginning. Revelations 13:8, the Lamb was slain before the foundation of the world. Romans 8:20-22, creation groans in futility, not because it was made that way, but because it was subjected to it. Jesus' miracles are not merely interruptions of nature, but reversals of its entropy, healing blindness, reversing death, right? Lazarus was raised from the dead after he already smelled of rot. And then he comes forth, right? Jesus raised himself from the dead 3 days later after being buried in a tomb. So if God can step into time and raise a dead man, reversing days of decay in a moment, then why would it be harder to imagine the reverse, that a fracture in human will could ripple through the fabric of time like a fault line, bending even nature out of harmony? If we broke our relationship with God, and God is outside of time, then we should see the effects of that broken relationship all throughout time, right? So I'm a Warhammer fan. I don't know if you could see, probably not in here, some of my Warhammer stuff. It's like there's the chaos god of named Slaanesh, which the elves, the Eldar, brought into being. And it's like, well, I was thinking, man, if chaos is out, the chaos gods, if they're outside of time, then Slaanesh should always have existed, yet it could still have been created at a certain point. Now we're getting too weird into Warhammer stuff, but science fiction can help at least chew or meditate on some of these thoughts. But so this is the Mosaic rewrite I was referencing, right? It's like Moses putting his hand into his cloak. One moment clean, the next leprous, the next clean again. Or Jesus seeing an unclean man and saying, I only see clean, right? When Jesus touched a leper, you can't prove that Jesus broke any law, because did he really touch the leper? The moment he touched him, his whole body was clean. At what point in time did the leper have his leprosy healed, right? So to the theist, the world is not just physical space-time, but a canvas God actively paints in layers and textures and sometimes in reversals. And if God paints with time the way we paint with color, then retroactive causality is not absurd. It's divine composition. And it fits within our experienced worldview, because the only way we would know that anything was changed would be if someone wrote it down, a la Genesis chapter 1, right? So Alex, here's where I'm going to, come at you a little bit more personally. You once said you're a violently agnostic determinist. So let's try something radical. What if you've been looking at the data correctly, but from the wrong timeline? What if the suffering you see is not evidence of a cruel designer, but the bruising of a once whole world, fractured by moral agency, not flawed mechanics? And I would say the fact that it rings true to you, that there should be something better, is evidence of your imago Dei, of your ruach, of the breath of God in you, your image of God that's been imparted to you. You should feel that this is out of place and wrong, because you were created not for this world, but to yearn for a better one. And you know what you're doing? You have within you a yearning for a better one, at least through this argumentation. So God is not within time. Time is within God. The fall is not a historical footnote. It's a metaphysical rupture. Retrocausality is only absurd in closed materialist systems, but in an open theistic cosmos, it's theologically coherent and narratively necessary. Jesus didn't just fix nature. He revealed what it was supposed to be all along. For Alex to reject for Alex to reject this premise is to reject his own premise according to 1 and 2. Alex's entire argument against God, the 6-point theodicy we laid out, is contingent on accepting that 1, God is omnipotent and omnibenevolent. If he's omnipotent, then he has the power to change time. If God is the author of all metaphysical laws, as your premise puts out there, that includes time and causality. So if you turn around and say, well, you can't have, that kind of divine retroactive causality is absurd, well, you're implicitly denying the very God you defined at the start of the argument. So again, it just begs the question, if you reject it, if you reject what you posited. So in other words, you can't say God is omnipotent over time and causality and then rule out his ability to retroactively alter causality. To do so is to neuter your own premise and smuggle in a naturalistic concept of time as your true metaphysical bedrock, which again, you can test against your own framework, but it doesn't work for testing the internal coherence of this framework. So the deeper tension for Alex This is where his naturalism quietly hijacks his theism. He grants a theistic God, but for the sake of argument, but then judges that God from within a naturalist box. We'll talk about more of that in the next video coming out next week when we talk about slavery and genocide. And I promise you guys, I go all the way down. I'm like, in that video, I say slavery and genocide. Let's go to a worldwide flood. Let's go to hell and damnation, right? Let's go all the way. That's what I like to do. You got to walk everyone down the end of the road for their viewpoints. And so, assuming things like linear causality is absolute, the second law of thermodynamics cannot be rewritten, time is an independent dimension that constrains even God. But you can't really assume those things and ask your premise and test the internal coherency. You've shifted your framework back to a naturalism. So if God authored time and causality, then suffering doesn't have to obey linear development. Retroactive consequence is not only possible, it's philosophically demanded in a world where God gives free agency to creatures inside a system he exists outside of. Here's my bottom line. If Alex dismisses retrocausality on the grounds that it doesn't make sense, he is not arguing against theology. He's rejecting his own premise about the nature of God. I think I've overstated that. But there's one final point I want to rest on. Man, this video is way too long, but I've tried to give you guys good content. For anyone who sat through this whole thing, God bless you, man. But I got to end on this. Alex talks about it would take firsthand, personal revelation. He would need to experience God. So Alex has admitted that he would love for God to impress upon him in an experiential way, but up until now, he hasn't felt that. And I got to be honest, as I've heard Alex express that multiple times with multiple people, as a theist who believes in Jesus, who believes in God, a divinely experiential God that can be experienced, right? I think you can. That hit, and I had to sit in that tension. If God has revealed himself to me, and I believe he has, and I've had some very serious moments with Jesus where he was the most real thing on earth and closer to me than a brother, right? Very, very personal experiences. So if I've had that, why hasn't Alex? And I had to sit on that and literally pray like, Lord, why haven't you? And also pray, Lord, will you? But then I was reminded of a few things. And I still keep that prayer. I hope God will. But Pilate sat in front of Jesus, who was truth itself. And Pilate asked, what is truth? And Jesus remained silent. And Pilate walked away. Jesus didn't grab him by the arm and stop him. He didn't explain himself. Pilate asked, what is truth, and walked away because he didn't really want to know. He wasn't open. Nicodemus said, teach me. He came to Jesus in the middle of the night and asked for everything. And Jesus explained it all explicitly. John chapter 3, and this is where we get like John 3:16, where we lay out a lot of our, doctrine of salvation. But we would say, while Jesus was telling everyone not to talk about miracles, while he said his time had not yet come, while he was speaking in parables and metaphors, right? And he says to them, it's not given to know. He gives Nicodemus a special treat. And he says, you call yourself a teacher. Here's everything I came to do. And Nicodemus is confused by it. Jesus gives him almost this Dr. Strange, Ancient One kind of like, mind-blowing, like, here's everything I came to do. And Nicodemus doesn't become Jesus' disciple. He doesn't follow him, right? He's not like Jairus, who comes to him from a miracle. So even Jesus laying out all of his truth verbally to Nicodemus wasn't enough. So you have one person who won't hear the answer. You have one person who gets the answer and won't internalize it. And then you have Paul, who's a strange character because he loved God, but he was killing Christians. So then Jesus reveals himself, says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Blinds him, knocks him off of his, horse, and then corrects him. And Paul completely, tonally shifts. His whole life shifts. Everything shifts. And Pilate, Nicodemus, and Paul. I would ask, which one is Alex, right? Is he a Pilate? Is he asking what is truth, but not really interested in hearing the answer? As he's as he has explanations from, amazing theologians and has every point he brings up refuted and is left with no other refutations to bring up. He exhausts himself and has no other data to go off of. And like, for example, the historicity of the cross, Alex just says, well, I don't know, but something weird happened Easter morning, but I won't say it's Jesus unless, like doubting Thomas, Jesus shows up and I can put my fingers into the holes in his hands, right? It's kind of what Alex seems to be saying there. Is it a what is truth moment and walking away, right? Is it a Nicodemus teach me, and then he has it all laid out, but he can't comprehend it and is like, I don't know what to do with that, right? I think Alex has received some amazing knowledge and arguments with high explanatory power. And yet he asks the same questions for 4 years. I've seen him asking the same questions over and over, not seeming to alter his questions at all, not even asking better questions. He goes through the same list that gets exhausted every time. It's as if he wants to see if any other theist can do as good as William Lane Craig did. And he doesn't internalize it. He doesn't shift. He doesn't change. So, there's this parable of the beggar Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man looks up to Abraham and says, send Lazarus to go tell my brothers of this place so that they don't wind up here like me. And he says, well, Abraham responds and says, well, they have the law, they have the prophets. If they won't listen to them, then they won't believe, even if someone would have returned from the dead. And really, that's what Alex got. He got someone who returned from the dead, Jesus. And Alex says, listen, man, something weird happened on Easter morning, but I will not believe that a man rose from the dead. And so such a one as him won't believe, even if someone were to rise from the dead. I don't know. I feel like if personal revelation of Jesus showing up would work, maybe he would do it. I don't know. Why did Jesus stay quiet in front of Pilate? Why did he tell Nicodemus everything that he wanted to hear, even though he knew it wouldn't be enough? I don't know. I think that's between Alex and God. But what would it take to save Alex O'Connor? Openness. Maybe. Again, only Alex knows. But I'd at least like to see his questions shift. He spent 4 years asking the same questions. Is this the end of atheistic, naturalistic, skeptical thought? Have all the questions you guys can think of already been asked and already been answered? If you're going to continue to be a skeptic, can you be a better skeptic? Can you evolve as a skeptic? I would just like to see a shift. I'd like to see you have William Lane Craig back on, and I'd like you to ask different questions. I'd like you to address his refutations. Otherwise, have you adopted skepticism as a merit badge, as a badge of honor? Are you living in skepticism because you're afraid to follow the consequence? I don't know. But I feel like you've been given everything that you've asked for. And short of Jesus showing up and you being able to put your fingers in his hands, seems like then Jesus never should have ascended into heaven by that belief, right? He would need to appear to everyone. And I don't think that's the kind of faith God asks us to have. He said to Thomas, blessed are you because you've seen, but blessed are those who believe who haven't seen. And I think, honestly, you've seen. I think you've seen all the data. I think you've seen all the arguments. I think you've had the greatest view in sight. And you don't believe anyways. I don't know. That's just where I'm at. But my heart goes out to you. I hope you hear the sincerity in this. Or at least I've got people who are fans of Alex who also watch me. So I hope maybe they can hear my sincerity. But yeah, I mean, if you're out there, if you're going to be a skeptic, then I at least ask that you become a better skeptic, and that when you're testing a framework for its internal coherency, that you don't shift the framework with your own naturalistic framework. We're going to get into this next week, but at a certain point, you stop testing the internal coherency and you just start asking, well, does this satisfy me emotionally? And there's a time and place for that, but it wasn't the question you started to ask. And you need to be intellectually honest and realize that you've shifted from your line of questioning and skepticism into emotional appeals for yourself. And that's worth noting. Anyways, guys, thank you for anyone who's stayed with me this long. God bless you guys. And I hope that this has been interesting kind of breakdown. I'm going to get a lot of arguments or a lot of comments that are going to be rude. And to them, I would just respond to the words of Jesus. If I've misspoken, show me where I've misspoken. Otherwise, why do you hit me? Right? Accusing my weight or my mouth breathing or anything like that. I promise you, I go to enough therapy where my own inner critic is way worse than anything you could say to me. All right. I love you guys. Bye.